Welcome everybody to Game Retail Ramblings, episode number 28. I'm your host, Travis Severance, coming to you live from the hot chicken strip capital of the world, Rochester, New York today. We've got a booming enterprise of restaurants coming into Henrietta area that are selling chicken, some better than others. Today we're going to talk about TCGs, but I just wanted to say thanks to everybody that stopped by to check out the other show that I'm sort of warming up and getting into behind the counter. You get to hear somebody's voice that isn't necessarily mine talking about what they're doing in the retail world. I also had Scott from Renegade on to talk about some of the stuff that he's gone through with publishing. I think we're going to continue that series, but I'm going to focus a little bit more on GRR for the next couple of weeks because there's a bunch of stuff that's sort of going on and the holidays are coming up. So it's a good time of year to sort of get down and talk about meat and potatoes game store retail. Today we're going to talk about TCGs and sort of the state of TCGs. A couple of months back, I talked about them loosely, so I wanted to sort of break everything down. This conversation that I'm having with you, I want to preface by saying this is what we're experiencing here in this store. Doesn't necessarily mean that if you're listening to this and you're a player of a game that your game is bad. It doesn't mean if you're listening to this that you're a publisher and you're doing a crappy job because our results are not as good as you'd like them to be. It's not a personal attack on how you're choosing to spend your leisure activity playing card games. It's just meat and potatoes, basically how things are going for us. And I ran some sales analysis numbers with last year. The data and the information on that is a little bit wonky because we didn't have a lot of Lorcana data last year. We didn't have Star Wars Unlimited at all yet. Star Wars Unlimited hadn't come out yet. And at this point right now, last year, I was poo-pooing Star Wars Unlimited because I didn't think it was very good. Now, we circle a full calendar year and I'm sort of feeling back to where I felt in the beginning, but I'll get to that in a little bit. So let me break down sort of the differences that I have for games, and I'm just going to use. I'm sure if you watch any videos out there, you've seen people do breakdown based on S tier, A tier, B tier, C tier, D tier, and then off meta with one of those little charts and things like that. I'm not fancy. I don't have that little yellow chart with all the stuff, and I don't bring the thing in, and I didn't want to put that on my production team, so I'm just going to talk about it as it goes. Something to consider on these tiers is my tiers, because I'm a retailer trying to make money in this business, are going to be based on sales overall. I'm not talking specifically about the quality of the game or the community or the events or the publisher or anything like that. I'm talking about the revenue that's being generated for us in store and how we approach that. Depending on how much revenue a game is generating, that's how much time we're going to put into the game itself in terms of how many events are going to be on the calendar, whether or not we're going to carry singles, how we're going to price our sealed, how much sealed we're going to order, how little sealed we're going to order, what event opportunities we're going to take on. Are we going to get outside of the confines of whatever their standard organized play program is to try to do something extra with it? Are we going to put time into looking at onboarding players from a demo day perspective or something like that? So to start it out on the top, S tier for us is Magic the Gathering. It's by far the straw that stirs the drink for us. We've had a long standing history of Magic the Gathering in the store. Rochester Draft was invented in our store many moons ago and stuff. So if I take a look at where we're at right now this year for Magic sales, it's 3.5 times as much as our second place card game in the store. And if I take a look at every other card game in the store and I add their revenue together, it's as much as that and an additional 10% on top. So Magic is a really big deal in the store. It's similar in when I try to compare Dungeons & Dragons to literally the rest of the role-playing field. Dungeons & Dragons is about in the same spot. It's probably 4 times the rest of the field combined together. So these things are big, giant juggernauts. And while there's pluses and minuses to them, I don't want to get into a big conversation on Magic this week, because next week I'm going to do an entire show just on Magic and sort of the way we're going to approach Magic in the next 12 months as a store. Magic's also up as far as like gross sales and stuff goes. It's up 16% for us, which doesn't sound like a lot until you, like if I showed you what the gross number is, the gross number is gross. And it's 16% higher than what it was last year and stuff. So the things that they're doing over there and how they've managed the game and how we've sort of pushed forward with the game has been successful. A tier for me is Pokemon. I say that with a caveat in that if I take a look at where our Pokemon sales are right now and I were to compare them to where they were last year, Pokemon's actually down about 26% for us. The majority of that is in sealed sales. Our sealed sales are down 33%. The odd part about it is our profit is actually up. And part of the reason why is last year at this time, the market was kind of in a tailspin. September, October, releases weren't that great. There was a whole bunch of product in the market. Scarlet and Violet wasn't well received. The changes for standard that they announced were things that people were a little bit concerned about. Yu-Gi-Oh! Was in sort of a weird space. They had come off of a successful tin and moved into a couple of next two sets that weren't exactly exciting. So we were doing a ton of liquidation at this time last year because I looked at what I had for an inventory load versus what we had sold throughout the year, and I was sort of upside down on the product. So I ended up liquidating out a whole bunch of stuff. So when I look at what I did for Pokemon last year compared to this year, you know, that 26%, I was selling it at a 5 or a 10% margin at the end of the day. So it was good. I got to get all that capital and be able to reinvest it. But what it also did was it made me approach this year a little bit differently. So when we talk about Pokemon, for example, there's so many different SKUs that come out for Pokemon that are sort of built for big box stores, and that's not to say that we can't sell them and we can't utilize them, but when I looked at what I had as far as waste product goes, a lot of the product lived there. It wasn't so much that I was overstocked on booster boxes. While I was a little bit, it just wasn't what I was overstocked on, like the specialty stuff. So I think what happened was, sort of coming off the COVID years where anything that had Pokemon listed on it I could sell for above MSRP a lot of times, to sort of flattening down to reality, lessons learned on that. So this year I tightened up our stock on a lot of things, and really I only lean into anymore the ETBs and the booster boxes themselves. Everything else I'm kind of okay selling for the first 30 or 45 days. Very little of that extra accessory sort of product stuff do I look at wanting to hold on to for any period of time, because the reality of it is the opportunity for growth in that product is a lot less than it is when I look at what boxes do and what the Elite Trainer boxes do. So Pokemon's down, but profit's up. So it's kind of a weird thing that we're selling, you know, a third less, but the profit for the line is up specifically because I don't have as much waste, because I took a look at sort of what we were doing in that space and changed it up. Now, our community is just as good as it was, if not better now. And if I compare side to side, our single sales are actually up a touch. So our sealed sales are down, but a lot of that is because I corrected what the ordering was that was going on. And single sales have maintained and are actually up 5 or 6%, which again, doesn't sound like a lot until you get into like a 6-figure number on that. B tier. The first game that I have in B tier is One Piece. One Piece is a game that has just exploded and gone crazy. It was one of our best games last year. It has had 30% growth for us this year in terms of regular retail sales. We don't carry singles, and part of the reason that we don't carry singles is just due to the fact that allocations on the product is so tight and it's so difficult to figure out what those things are going to look like, that I'd rather provide the community with sealed product. We get a good amount of sealed product, but we don't have a ton of it. It runs really hot for a long time. It specifically will end up increasing in value over time as opposed to most of the other stuff. That's not to say they haven't had a couple of sets that haven't been as hot as other stuff, but what I've learned about One Piece is a lot of times the stuff that comes out and it's not really hot, if I wait 3 to 4 or 5 months, it comes back around. There were some starter decks that came out that were not the most exciting things that I thought I was really over on, and slowly but surely they became meta relevant and all of a sudden they started to fly. So One Piece is in a really good spot. It's the number 3 best-selling game that we have in the store. Again, we don't sell singles. That's going to change probably with this newest set. It looks like our allocation is going to be a little bit more than what I thought it was going to be. I spread out a little bit more too, so I've committed to one distributor as far as being my primary distributor, but I'm also flexing out to as many other distributors as I can to see if I can capture a little bit more product so that I can be able to sell singles, because with the growth that the sealed product has had, not that the single sales won't come in and take a bit of a hit from that, because if I'm selling singles, I'm probably selling less sealed to a degree, but the sealed product does really well online for us as well. So I should preface this by saying everything that I'm talking about that we're selling here is all the stuff we're selling in store. Online sales are completely different. It's a whole different way that we run a business. It's approached in a completely different way than what this is. So this is just brick and mortar sales, front of the counter, back of the house, that sort of thing. None of this has anything to do with what we're doing on TCG Player or eBay or any of those other spaces, because that's a completely different conversation. Number 4 for us is Lorcana. Lorcana numbers are okay. They're obviously up from where they were last year, but last year we only had the first set that was out at this time. First chapter did really well. I will say that Lorcana and Star Wars Unlimited are the 2 games that I'm most concerned about right now, based on what they did out of the gates and where they've both landed. Lorcana, the new box, Azurite Sky, is pre-ordering for 110. The last set, Ursula's Revenge, is almost below cost at this point as far as where it's selling. Shimmering Skies is also not anything that's doing really well as far as pricing goes. The community has been okay. The store championships did really well, but the rest of the stuff, it's definitely not selling through at the volume that it was before. So similar to what I had to do with Pokemon, I sort of need to check myself and pull back a little bit on Lorcana because we're just not seeing the sell-through. Now, some of that has to do with the fact that there's just more product that's being printed and more product that's being made. They announced before this new set was announced that they were opening up distribution with more distributors, which means there's going to be more distribution outlets, which means to me that the distributors they had weren't selling the volume that they wanted them to sell, so they're adding in some other people to try to sell. So those new distributors coming in, I'm sure they looked at it as a big giant boon, but the reality of it is I think the market itself is sort of slowing down in that game pretty significantly. And I think some of it has to do with the challenges of the commingling of the community and the way that Ravensburger has managed the game in general. They sort of took an adversarial approach towards retail in the early days when First Chapter was having such a struggle as far as pricing goes and things like that. And what happens is it's fine when you have all the shine, but when you don't have the shine and you also have the worst margins in the industry as far as CCG pricing goes compared to what your MSRP is, the first place that retail is looking to ditch, if you're not being able to sell them at the volume that you're moving in the first place, is going to be the one that they're making the least amount of money on. I'm not comfortable enough to bet against Mickey Mouse. We're not stopping carrying the product and things like that. We're just taking a lot more of a cleaner look at what we're ordering for each set moving forward based on what we've been stuck with for the last two, actually really three sets when I look at the totality of the product line. Number 3 in the B tier is Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a game that we've carried since day one. It has had its ups and downs. I think, it's the third longest selling game in the marketplace at this point. We've got a really good community. We run some really great events. The amount of opportunity that we've had to run the bigger events has been pretty well. Our pre-releases are doing pretty well, but the amount of product of theirs that goes and it launches and day one it's dead versus it has some life to it is small. I think what happens with that game a lot of times is the market ends up getting pretty flat and it ends up being static because it feels like all of the emotion in that game is based around when they decide arbitrarily when they're going to drop the banned and restricted list. So what happens is the new set comes out, there's some Insano deck, or there's a bunch of Insano decks, and there's a bunch of cards that spike, and that stuff sells out, and it does really well, and people complain about the price, and they complain about the deck, and so on and so forth. And then what happens is the entire community goes into this weird holding pattern of, do you want to sell? Well, I don't know. Should this get banned? Yes. No, I don't think so. But I have that, but I don't want to get rid of it. Do you want to sell it now? So as retailers, we're sitting there doing this weird dance with consumers about, do we want to buy that thing because it's probably going to get banned and we don't know when it's going to get banned. And Yu-Gi-Oh, whether they think it's tactically a good business idea or not, they don't have their banned and restricted list set on any kind of regimented calendar. So it just becomes this vomiting horse meme. When are they going to pass the thing out? Like, get to the point where you've decided to tell your community you're going to do this thing. And don't do things like drop banned and restricted lists in the middle of giant events that are big national events. Like, be a little bit more structured about the way you are. So this sort of bipolar thing with the game and with the product is hard to sort of manage. And the amount of reprints and how quickly and how heavily they do the reprints makes it so that it's something that's a difficult game to sort of figure out what the market's going to be like. And the other side of it too is without any sort of rotation or any sort of flattening or anything like that, the game has sort of gotten to the point where it's sort of collapsing under itself. It's got so many different segments on the side and things that aren't going to be used on the playmat and different things like that, that it's like, why are we doing all these different things? I really wish that Yu-Gi-Oh would take a look at, and Konami would take a look at sort of this soft standard reset that Magic is doing with Foundations and maybe just expand on that idea. So if you don't want to do a rotation and we're still going to have to deal with 20 years worth of cards, 25 years plus worth of cards at this point, why don't you come up with a core set that says that this is what we're going to do and we're moving forward with this, plus maybe the last 2 or 3 years worth of releases, and we just flatten everything out. And I think there really needs to be some sort of approach to the game holistically on what they're going to do moving forward. And as a retailer, ordering the product is really hard to do because you can't guess. You can't figure out when things are hot and when they're not. You've also got this misalignment between what the meta is in America versus what the meta is in Japan. So when you have these international events and stuff like that once a year when they do their events, it's this mixed band list thing that just is really hard to follow. And then their digital app as well has its own meta that's some combination of both of them. Just get everything under one house and then approach it that way from the top down. So that's Yu-Gi-Oh! My last B tier game would be Star Wars Unlimited. Star Wars Unlimited, the trajectory of that game has gone in the exact opposite direction of what I had hoped for, and it feels like all the mistakes that I was concerned about as far as the game having this massive critical success in the first set has come through in spades. Somehow, they managed to produce a second set that was very weak, that was overprinted, that we can't get out from underneath. Outside of showcases, if you take a look at the quality of the rares and the mythics in that set, they're fairly weak. The Boba Fett banning that they just did is intelligent. It's going to shake up the meta. It's going to take some time. People are going to be able to go back in the lab and figure some stuff out and understand that Star Wars Unlimited now is a very new game without that threat in the meta space anymore. But I knew things were in rough shape when I looked at the box prices for the third set the day that it was going on launch, and it was sub $85 on TCG Player. I want to see that number above 90 at least to think that things are healthy, like in a collectible space. And I've said this before, I think if you're a collectible game seller, then your target for your market should be about 80% satisfaction with regard to product. You need about 20% of the people out there that want to get a hold of things to not be able to get a hold of it. Otherwise, your values don't hold, because if everything's available, then it's actually not collectible and it just floors itself. So when I take a look at set 3 and I erase hyperspace and I get rid of the, if I get rid of the spotlights, there's only one card that's above $20 right now. Brand new set. Thing just came out a couple weeks ago. One card above $20. The rest of the cards in the set are below $20, and the box prices are below $90. I'm not sure. Is this over? No. Again, like I said about Lorcana, I'm not going to bet against Yoda. We're going to continue selling the game. I hope that they end up righting the ship and figuring out supply and stuff, but they went into this thing with the first set with this idea that they were going to gate product, and they were going to release trickle to be able to deal with the market. Set 2, it was just full allocation normally, and boom, it got spit out, and there was one more wave of restock that I passed on because I had too much of it. Set 3, I saw no grumbling about allocation. I got everything that I wanted. I didn't have any problems getting product. There's still product to be able to buy. So there's no gated allocation, and or the market already got everything that they wanted. This set, I feel like from a power level standpoint, is stronger. But the other thing that sort of hurt the game too was they just decided to get on Melee. So when they switched over from their own software that didn't work to Melee, I don't think they had a real accurate way to be able to decide how many people they actually had engaged in the community that were playing the game. So the first set, you had a bunch of people that came in that wanted to play the game and a bunch of retailers that wanted to sell the game. There was good opportunity. It was underprinted for what the demand was going to be. But in the mix of that, you had a bunch of Johnny-come-latelys that were just looking for opportunities as far as what the dollars were going for those boxes. And then you had a bunch of players that were attracted to it too because their deck was worth 4 times what they paid for it. When that starts to fade away and you don't have that value coming to the table, you're stuck with just what the game is. And what the game is, if it's a collectible game and there's not real value and you don't feel like that value is going to hold, you're going to suffer long term. So we're going to see what's going to happen with those guys. I mean, there's a small set. I just got my numbers in for set 1, the restock that's coming. It's not a ton of product. It's not nothing, but it's not a ton. I think it'll definitely have an impact on those set 1 singles and things like that. It'll allow the opportunity for some more people to be able to get into the game that maybe couldn't feel like they could afford it, because there's so many good cards that are in the set set 1 that you have to absolutely have. So I think there's maybe an opportunity for retailers that might have passed on running this thing to be able to buy some set 1, and they'll have set 2 and set 3 as well that they'll be able to get a hold of. But I'm concerned with where Star Wars Unlimited is headed based on these first 3 sets. And it's all the stuff that I had sort of talked about before where you could go wrong. C tier. So typically with S tier and A tier, we definitely carry singles for. With B tier, other than One Piece, which is one that I talked about, the reason why we don't carry singles is because supply, selling that as a sealed product is a more profitable endeavor for me than it is for selling sealed or selling singles, and we'll change that. C tier, we usually sell singles on the first set, and then after that we sort of see what the market's going to do with it. So when I talk about C tier, if I look at everything on the list for C tier, Star Wars Unlimited sells 4 times as much as all these games at minimum. So C tier is Digimon. Digimon, there's no change for that game. Now, that was a game that I thought was going to fall off a cliff, but Bandai made the decision that they were going to try to align the meta for that game with the Japanese meta, which is interesting. So what's happened is they've packed the last couple of sets full of a bunch of cards that were in future sets in Japan. So you got these super hot sets. Where Digimon was 6 months ago to where it's been now is significantly different for me. Whether or not that'll end up holding when they get side by side with the meta in Japan, we'll see. I'm hopeful for it. I've got a good community for that. It's, again, not something that we didn't sell singles past the first set for that game because it sort of it fell off a lot after the first set, which is fairly standard for Bandai games in general, but you know, One Piece has sort of bucked that trend. So Digimon has had a really nice comeback this last quarter, but it was garbage before that, and something at the beginning of the year that I was looking at, like whether or not we're going to carry it anymore. Altered is set in C tier, so that's more of a time and grade sort of thing. Do I have concerns for Altered? Yes, I do. What are my concerns for Altered? There's no marketplace. We're still waiting on a marketplace. Outside of that, my other concerns are talking with Equinox directly. They're sold out in Europe. Well, not the UK, but they're sold out in Europe and they're sold out in Australia, but they're not sold out in the UK and they're not sold out in the US. They're based in France. My concern is that if they look locally at how successful this game is doing and they don't look at the broader markets and what they're dealing with in the broader markets and seeing what the challenges are in the bigger markets that are out there, they'll just get lost and they'll get set back on their laurels thinking, oh, you know what, things are going great. They're not going great. When the marketplace is not up and we're almost 60 days into this launch thing, we don't have any real place like TCG Player to figure out what market value is and so on and so forth. It gets to be really rough. And when I look at some of the other retailers that really sort of leaned into this product and ran some higher level events and things like that, the attendance hasn't been there. Now, it's been there overseas, which is the reason why I'm hopeful for it. But I've also had to reduce my boxes down to a place where I could feel like I can move them and sit on them. The sad part about it is the thing could get turned on, the marketplace could get turned on, and it could go like that. But I can't sit around holding onto product waiting for the miracle. And part of the problem is without the marketplace, those retailers that decided to pass on the game without the spikes in the product and without the spikes in the uniques means that there's no onus for them to decide to get into the game unless there's pressure from players. Well, there isn't going to be pressure from players if players don't know what their cards are worth. So hopefully you get the marketplace going, and hopefully you get the print on demand going, and hopefully they make some sort of an announcement outside of set 2 is on the way. I'm excited about that. I'm still excited and confident in the game. I think the game is fantastic. I'm not worried about the stock position that I have or anything like that. The core group of players that we have in here is really good for the game, and our event attendance has been fantastic, but I really need them to get this marketplace up and going. Number 3, C tier, Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood for us, from a sales perspective, is really fading. I say that fully knowing that one of our locals went to Worlds and had a hell of a run. He almost top 8'd. Ian played really remarkably there. But if I look at it from the business standpoint, the Flesh and Blood sales for us are down 30%. It is a very difficult market to sell into. I think the players, due to the competitive nature and their willingness to want to spend, but only spend a certain amount, makes it a lot harder to be able to facilitate transactions with them. They've already got their favorite place to buy stuff, and even if I'm close to market price, if I'm $5 over, they are not budging. They're not looking to spend an extra $5 on a booster box at our store if they can get it cheaper. So I'm not sure where we go with Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood is a community of competitive players. I think it's a fantastic game. I think it is a very difficult game for somebody to try to onboard into because the cost of the cards are pretty expensive. But it's definitely not going through what it went through when we initially got onto it, which was occasionally some supply issues. Some of the sets would spike. We'd be able to make money on those. And when something came out and there was overproduction on it, whether it was Everfest and it was kind of, it landed soft, those things aren't happening. We didn't have any of those problems with Dynasty, Rosetta, heavy hitters. The only issues we're having is with the starter decks that were only allocated 6. I don't know why you would do starter deck allocation of 6 if you're trying to get players into the game, but it's a choice. So Flesh and Blood, I don't know. I mean, you know, another 30% from Flesh and Blood, and the numbers, it's around Shadowverse at that point, which is not growth. I'll fly through the rest of these. Sorcery's done really well for us. It's a very weird game, I'll admit it. It is more of a board game, card game than anything. Sales on it have been pretty good. The marketplace for that game is good. There's not a ton of product available, but it's one of those things that as a retailer, it's a difficult thing to try to lean into long term because there's just not a lot of sets coming out. And because of that, like the focus on what the game is and the meta is sort of can get stagnant really fast. So We did really well with the new set right out of the gates, and it's sort of slowed down and it's tapered off. We have some product available, but there's also some product issues out there. The restock on the beta boxes that we had evaporated. So I'm hopeful and encouraged for Sorcery, but it's just one of those things that, like, it's hard for us to take a look at leaning into on a weekly and a monthly basis moving forward when there's just nothing new coming out for the game. So you sort of got to hope that the people continue to iterate on what's there, and not all the time that isn't a recipe for success. Keyforge has done really well for us this year. It was up a ton from last year. I mean, almost, we've sold 6 times the amount of Keyforge this year as we sold last year. Now, some of that was that we had a Vault Tour and we were allowed to sell exclusive decks during the Vault Tour. Some of that is that they've changed sort of the way that they manage their Kickstarters, and they've allowed for some supplemental sets that retailers are allowed to purchase that are only available to retail. Those boxes are unobtainium. They're super, super hard to find, and they sell for really good value. Keyforge is one of those games where if you were looking at your event calendar and you had a small pocket of stuff and you had like maybe a decent LCG community, it feels like an LCG given the fact that you don't have to buy a ton of different cards and things like that, and you can come in and you can have a good time and casually play. It's certainly something that I'd take a look at if you were looking to just add a smaller game to there that can have a really nice community that's easy to sell. Shadowverse is next. Shadowverse is at the point where it's sort of we order as much of it as we think we can sell in the first week, and then we move on from it. It is it's the style game that it's overproduced for what the market wants. Boxes end up landing between $1 over cost to $5 under cost when the new set comes out. It's a smaller community that we have here. We continue to sell a reasonable amount of product for that, but it's not a huge line. You know, any of these things that I'm talking about in the C tier, any of those games could fall off the face of the earth for us, and it wouldn't really have an impact on the store long term. So just something to think about as far as Shadowverse goes. I think there's probably people that are selling Shadowverse and that's it, but it's one of those Bushiroad games that if we're not carrying it next year, I won't be surprised. UVS, 30% growth from last year. I think they're doing really good things. I think they've got a really interesting way to be able to micro engage when it comes to licenses and IPs. The way they do that is with the way that their product mix is. They can come out with a starter deck and sort of test the waters on smaller licenses to see if there's success there. It sort of fits the fandom of that game to be able to come in and take a look. It's still a challenging game to try to onboard people with because it's just a difficult game. There's a lot of complexity to it, and I can say the same thing about all of the games that are that old outside of maybe Pokemon. Pokemon isn't overly complex. But if I look at Magic and I look at Yu-Gi-Oh! And I look at UVS, they all sort of have the weight of, more than 15 years of being in the market, and that can get challenging as far as all the things that you've done to sort of iterate the game to keep the game something that people want to play. So I'm confident in the team that's in place over there. I think they've done a really nice job as far as, the quality of their product, their actual product itself. You look at the cards, you look at the artwork, you look at what they're putting forward is tops in the market. It's very, very good stuff. But they still have this hurdle of how do we get more people to the game. Union Arena, another Bandai game. And I'll be honest with you, I did not put a lot of stake into Union Arena. It certainly outperformed what I thought, which is always an encouraging thing. It's not going to set the world on fire. I think it's another game that you can do okay with if you have a fandom of Bandai games that are there. I think the licenses that are attached to each of the different sets is really going to drive sales on that. So not dissimilar to the way that Weiss sort of does their thing. Our sales on Weiss is really based on what the particular IP is and how much people care. So that sort of moves me to D tier. Now these are games that we carry, but we only carry because we're servicing a specific customer that wants a product. We don't have them on the shelf. We don't run events for them. We don't deal with them in any real way outside of a customer orders a box, we order that box, we sell them that box, and then we move on. And those games are Grand Archive, Alestrals, Weiss, and Final Fantasy. So 4 games there that we sell product for, that we carry. We don't really typically have any of that stuff out on our shelves. Alestrals we had on our shelves for a little while. There's a group here that might decide to run something for it, but right now we're not leaning into that game in any real way. Aside from that, as far as card games go, I mean, we carry all the LCGs. We also carry Doomtown. We also carry Netrunner. So we're a very card game focused heavy store when it comes to that sort of stuff. We know how to do card games pretty well. Magic is obviously outpacing and outclassing everybody at this point. The number of people that we have on staff that have familiarity with Magic is pretty significant. There's a lot of stuff going on with Magic, which is why I don't want to get into too much of it right now for this show. But next week, I'm going to do a full 30 minutes on my take on Magic and where I think Magic is. So that's sort of the state of TCGs for me locally here in the store, as far as what we're doing in our communities, the events that we're hosting, what we're selling for sealed product, and how things are going in general. I'm going to wrap it up with that because I think I'm actually over time. Anybody that wants to sit and chat with me for the next half hour in the comment section, feel free. I will be back next week. Like I said, focus is going to be all about Magic next week. So until next time, happy gaming. Thanks, everybody.